Jalen Dawson always knew that the world didn't play fair with boys like him. Growing up on the outskirts of Atlanta, among rundown buildings and a system that rarely offered second chances, he learned early on that every misstep could cost dearly. But unlike most of the neighborhood kids, Jalen didn't spend his afternoons on the court or wandering the streets. He preferred to lose himself among the codes and statutes that his mother, Denise, would leave scattered around the living room. A paralegal for more than 2 decades, she never hid from her son the complexities of the judicial system, nor its bias. It was among Denise's papers that Jalen discovered his fascination with the law. He studied on his own, memorized legal precedents, and practiced arguments in front of the mirror, so when he found himself handcuffed and accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit, he made a decision no one expected: he would defend himself. The courtroom seemed to swallow any trace of confidence as soon as Jalen walked through its doors. The atmosphere was oppressive: dark wooden furniture, an attentive audience, and the imposing presence of Judge Grayson, whose reputation for inflexibility was well known. Prosecutor Carrington, in her impeccable suit and sharp gaze, barely concealed her disdain for the situation. To her, it was just a game with a predictable outcome. Jalen, a 19-year-old black youth accused of robbery and resisting arrest without an attorney to guide him. It would be just another brief trial before lunchtime. However, as he settled into the defendant's chair, straightening his shoulders and steadying his nerves, something in the air shifted. Contrary to expectations, he didn't seem frightened. On the contrary, he was ready to fight. The trial began with the presentation of the case by the prosecution. Carrington spoke with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. The car, a silver 2018 sedan, had been found abandoned in a parking lot on the outskirts of the city. Inside it, Jalen's fingerprints were identified on the steering wheel and on the passenger door. In addition, a police officer was to testify that Jalen had resisted during the arrest that day, reinforcing the narrative that he not only stole the vehicle, but also attempted to flee from the police. It was an apparently solid case, at least on paper, but as soon as the prosecutor finished her explanation and turned to Jalen, as if already awaiting his anticipated defeat, he simply took a deep breath. "Excuse me, Your Honor," he said, his voice firm yet unassuming. "I would like to begin by clarifying some details about this evidence." Murmurs filled the courtroom instantly. It was a break from expectation. No one imagined he would take the initiative so early. Jalen walked calmly to the defense podium, his footsteps echoing in the silent space. He knew that his greatest asset was not to immediately prove his innocence, but rather to plant doubts, and he would start with the officer's testimony. "You said that I resisted arrest," he began, addressing the officer who was testifying against him. "Could you describe exactly how that happened?" The officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a hardened expression, adjusted himself in the chair. "You hesitated when I asked you to put your hands on your head. We had to handcuff you by force." Jalen nodded, as if absorbing the words, but then quickly countered, "So hesitating for a second means resisting arrest?" An uncomfortable silence took over the room. Before the officer could respond, Jalen continued. "Moreover, the approach took place on my street, right in front of my house, where I was waiting for a friend. I wonder how someone who had just stolen a car could be so calm, without showing any urgency to flee." He paused briefly, letting the doubt hang in the air. Judge Grayson leaned forward slightly, intrigued. For the first time, Jalen's words did not sound like the desperate defense of a frightened boy, but rather like a well-structured argument. Carrington tried to regain control. She stood, adjusted her blazer, and shot an incisive look at Jalen. "The issue is not whether you resisted arrest or not, but the fact that your fingerprints were found on the stolen car," she stated, her voice laden with conviction. "Can you explain how that happened?" Jalen knew that this was the central piece of the prosecution's case. He took a deep breath. "Yes, I can," he replied without hesitation. Turning to the jury, aware that every word needed to be calculated, he continued, "I have been in that car before, but not because I stole it." A new murmur swept through the room, and Grayson banged his gavel, demanding order. Carrington folded her arms, impatient. Jalen pressed on. "The owner of the car, Mr. Randall, hired me to wash the vehicle 2 weeks before the theft. I touched the steering wheel, the doors, the windows. My fingerprints being there does not prove that I was the one who took the car." The prosecutor frowned, but before she could counter-argue, Jalen went further. "By the way, where are the forensic records showing that only my fingerprints were on the vehicle? If the car was stolen and used by someone else, it's unlikely that only I left prints on it." The prosecution had no immediate answer. The jury exchanged glances, some clearly rethinking the case. Judge Grayson, who at first seemed disinterested, now watched Jalen with a different attention. The young man sensed the opportunity and pushed further. "Another thing that intrigues me," he continued, turning again to the officer. "When you filed the police report, you mentioned that the owner of the vehicle stated he didn't know me, correct?" The officer nodded in agreement. "But isn't that curious? Mr. Randall personally paid me to wash the car, saw me working on it, handed me the keys to clean the interior, and now all of a sudden he doesn't remember me." A tension gripped the room. Jalen looked directly at Carrington, who was leafing through her documents as if searching for a way to regain ground. If there was no attempt at manipulation, why is the only concrete evidence against me something so easily explained? The silence was heavy. Gradually, the confidence the prosecution had shown at the beginning of the trial began to give way to something different. Uncertainty. Jalen sensed the subtle shift in the courtroom. The unwavering confidence of the prosecution no longer seemed so firm, and the jury began to show signs of doubt. But he knew that was not enough. He needed to make it clear that the case against him was nothing more than a flimsy narrative, built on assumptions rather than facts. "Your Honor, I would like to ask for clarification," he said, turning to the judge. "The state bases its accusation on fingerprints, but at no point did it present security camera footage or eyewitnesses placing me at the wheel of the car at the time of the theft. How can a case be so solid if there is no direct evidence that I was the one who took the vehicle?" Grayson maintained a neutral expression, but something in his posture indicated he was considering the question. Carrington, however, was not ready to give in. "The absence of cameras does not mean the crime didn't happen," she retorted, "and it doesn't mean that the defendant is innocent either." Jalen smiled slightly. "Exactly," he said, letting the answer hang in the air. "And the absence of concrete evidence does not mean that I am guilty." The comment provoked new exchanges of glances in the jury. The prosecution was cornered, but Jalen knew he still had one last blow. He turned again to the officer. "Another detail catches my attention," he said, picking up a sheet from the file. "It states that the car was found 8 kilometers from the location where I was stopped. How exactly would I have gotten home so quickly without anyone seeing me flee? Did anyone see me running in the streets? Was I captured on any nearby camera?" The officer hesitated before answering. "There are no records of that, but—" Before he could finish, Jalen raised his hand, politely cutting him off. "There are no records, because that never happened." The silence in the courtroom was almost deafening. Judge Grayson looked at Carrington, who pressed her lips together, knowing her case was falling apart. The young man took a deep breath and concluded, "All you have against me are fingerprints on a car that I touched before the theft. Is that enough to destroy someone's life?" The weight of the question lingered. It wasn't just about him. It was about how many other young people had already been convicted based on fragile evidence, flawed proceedings, in a system that saw only numbers and not nuances. The impact of Jalen's words still hung in the air when Carrington, with a tense expression, turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the state maintains that there is enough evidence to proceed with the case." She tried to sound firm, but her confidence was not what it once was. Jalen knew that she needed to maintain her posture, but he also knew that his argument had cracked the foundation of the accusation. "And what exactly are these pieces of evidence, prosecutor?" he countered, folding his arms. "Because so far, all we've heard are assumptions and gaps." Carrington pressed her lips and flipped through her papers, as if searching for something more solid. "The officer's testimony and the forensic records point to you as the main suspect," she insisted. "Besides, the vehicle was found in an area near your residence." Jalen let out a slight sigh. "Near? 8 kilometers is not exactly near, prosecutor. Unless there is evidence that I drove the car there, this is just another misinterpreted coincidence." Murmurs returned to the courtroom, and Grayson banged his gavel, calling for silence. Jalen knew he had achieved something crucial. He had turned the system against itself. What should have been a simple trial with a predictable verdict was now a succession of uncomfortable doubts, and he was not finished yet. "Let's talk about Mr. Randall," he said, picking up another sheet from the file. "The prosecution mentioned that he claimed not to know me. However, if we check the bank records, we will see a payment made by him directly to my account about 2 weeks before the theft." Carrington paled. It wasn't a fact she had highlighted in her case, and now it was being used against her. "If he really didn't know me," Jalen continued, "why would he pay me for a service?" Judge Grayson interlaced his fingers, thoughtful. He looked at Carrington, waiting for her response, but the prosecutor remained silent. The entire courtroom seemed suspended in that moment. Jalen, a 19-year-old boy without a lawyer, without courtroom experience, was dismantling the case piece by piece. Not because he was a genius, but because he knew very well how the system worked. And he knew that when confronted with logic, it crumbled. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Jalen felt the weight of countless eyes on him, some curious, others skeptical, but all attentive. He took a deep breath and continued. "Now, I would like to understand another thing," he said, turning again to the officer. "When the car was found, was there any analysis done to check for fingerprints from people other than mine?" The police officer cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "The forensics did find fingerprints, yes, but the ones that were analyzed and linked to the system belonged to you." Jalen furrowed his brow. "All right, but does that mean that other prints were found?" The officer hesitated for a second longer than he should have. "Yes," he admitted, "but they were not in the database." Jalen let the words resonate in the room before continuing. "So there were other fingerprints on the car, prints that could belong to the real culprit, and yet I was arrested based solely on mine because they already had my record in the system. Doesn't that seem like an investigative error?" Carrington shifted in her chair, trying to mitigate the damage. "The investigation followed standard procedures," she said, maintaining her composure. But Jalen wouldn't let it go. "And what are those procedures? Assuming the guilt of the first young black man whose fingerprints appear on a stolen car." The question was cutting, and a slight murmur spread among the spectators. Judge Grayson banged his gavel again. "Mr. Dawson, please stick to the case." Jalen nodded, but he did not retract. "I am, Your Honor. The focus of the case is that the accusation against me was made hastily and without proper investigation. What we are witnessing here is not a trial based on evidence, but one based on convenience." He turned to the jury, his eyes scanning each one of them. "If it were anyone else, someone without a record in the system, would you even have made this accusation? Would you have dismissed other prints so quickly, or was I simply an easy target?" The impact of Jalen's words was immediate. Some jurors exchanged glances. Others fixed their gaze on the prosecutor, waiting for a response that never came. Carrington knew that any attempt to argue now would only worsen her position. The case, which had started with apparent certainty, was now a puzzle full of gaps. The courtroom was no longer the same as when the trial began. Earlier, Jalen was seen as a rebellious youth, reckless for defending himself. Now, he was a problem for the prosecution, a problem that had exposed too many holes in the case. Judge Grayson reclined in his chair, reflecting. "In light of the inconsistencies raised by the defense," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I wonder if this court received a sufficiently complete investigation to proceed with this accusation." Carrington opened her mouth, but soon closed it, knowing that any attempt to argue at that point would sound forced. Jalen remained firm. His heart pounded, but he did not show any nervousness. "Your Honor," he said in a firm voice, "the prosecution should be based on concrete facts, not on convenience. I did not ask for an easy trial, only a fair one." Grayson let out a long sigh. The weight of the moment was palpable. He lightly tapped his fingers on the bench before deciding. Given that the evidence presented is insufficient for a secure conviction, and considering the inconsistencies in the investigative process, this court cannot, in good conscience, uphold the charges against the defendant. A pause. Case dismissed. The gavel fell with a dry sound, ending the trial. For a second, no one moved. Jalen remained still, absorbing what had just happened. He had won, alone. The jury displayed expressions ranging from relief to disbelief. Carrington quickly gathered her papers, avoiding eye contact, while the officer who had testified against him averted his gaze. Jalen did not celebrate. He did not smile. He simply took a deep breath and left the courtroom with his head held high. He knew his fight wasn't over, but that day he had proven that justice, when confronted with truth, could still prevail. Outside the courtroom, the air seemed lighter. But Jalen knew that the victory of that day did not mean everything was resolved. He looked around and saw his mother, Denise, standing on the sidewalk, her eyes brimming with tears, yet saying nothing. She simply embraced him. It wasn't a celebratory hug, but one of relief. From a mother who knew just how close her son had come to being crushed by a system that never played in his favor. He wasn't naive. He knew that for many, he would still be seen as a young man who got lucky, and not as someone who simply demonstrated his innocence. But it didn't matter. He did not fight for acceptance. He fought for justice. As he walked home, he felt the eyes of some people on him. Some appeared admiring, others suspicious. He didn't care about any of them. His goal was not to prove anything to anyone, only to ensure that the truth was not ignored. Deep down, he knew that it wasn't every day that someone like him could leave a courtroom without handcuffs. But that morning, he defended himself. That morning, he turned the tables. And even if no one else remembered it the next day, he would remember it for the